Greetings and welcome to TH430 Christian Ethics, Session 9 on Reformation Ethics from Huebner's Introduction to Christian Ethics. So we will be discussing in Huebner's book, pages 98 through 116. Now, before we get started on the actual lesson, I would just like to go quickly over the goals of this session. And the goals are that the students would be able to, one, explain how ecclesiology and Christology impact a person's view of ethics, and two, discuss how different Reformation era approaches to ecclesiology and Christology impacted their view of what a person ought to do and not do. So, with that being said, we're going to move in to the beginning of the session. Now, I'm going to start actually not where Huebner starts. I'm going to start where Huebner ends with his Reformation ethic section, because it's there that Huebner gives us the framework that he's using to assess the changes in ethical approaches. And the process or framework he's using centers on ecclesiology and Christology. Okay, essentially, and this is quoting Huebner, to ask how a Christian should live or what he should do presupposes the question of how one is ecclesiologically situated, right? And this is not actually quoting him now, but this itself presupposes a particular view of who Christ is and how he works. Therefore, the question, how should a Christian act or live in a particular circumstance, will get answered differently depending on if you're a Catholic, he says, or in a monastery, or a Lutheran, or a Calvinist, or an Anabaptist. Now, you can see how this is going to impact the discussion that we have when we get to the three kind of reformers / Reformation movements that he covers, which is Lutheran, through Martin Luther, Calvin, and the Calvinist movement, and then the Anabaptists. How you understand Jesus' salvation impacts how you understand how the church ought to look and live, which in turn impacts how you're going to answer the question, what are my duties, obligations? How should I view others? Now, it's very interesting because as Huebner is moving through this, he introduces the analysis of one William Kavanaugh, who wrote a book called The Myth of Religious Violence. And it's worth noting because what Kavanaugh is doing in his book is challenging the narrative that says the secular state, okay, the rise in prominence, the rise historically of the secular state, and the prominent role of the secular state was necessary to overcome the violence of warring religious factions, okay? That's a predominant narrative that you will hear, all right? The secular state was necessary in order to overcome the religious differences within Europe, and in that way establish peace. Okay. Now, that's a dominant narrative, and it's often used to justify modern liberal values like tolerance, equality, individuality. So this approach to the relationship between the church and civil authority, Huebner will claim, has several negative impacts. So as you begin to see the rise of the secular state displace the church, and he's clear that he's setting us up for the next section, which is enlightenment. As this shift occurs, there are several negative impacts as a result of them. The first one is one we're probably familiar with. Well, we're familiar with all of them to a certain extent, but this first one especially. Religion becomes a private matter, right? You can believe anything you want, as long as you don't bring it to bear on public discourse and expect the conclusions you reach by virtue of your religion, okay, to impact or have any bearing on someone else besides you. If essentially it goes like this: if you want to believe that and you want to live that way, that's fine, but you can't impose that on me. Okay. Secondly, the state becomes the agent of salvation, right? I've mentioned this book before. There was a book that was published in the early 80s by a doctor named Menninger. And it's called Whatever Happened to Sin. And what he claims is that the language of sin has shifted into other categories. It's not that sin has gone away, sin never goes away, but we talk about it differently depending on our ideological orientation and these sorts of factors. And one that he says is morality is whatever is legal, right? So if I can get the state to endorse homosexual marriage, then homosexual marriage is moral, right? There's no distinction between morality and the law because the state has become the agent of salvation. So if you want to achieve the ideal state, whatever that may look like in your head, you need to pass the laws to get that done. Another impact of this, he doesn't bring it up, but this is another impact, is the inevitable abuse and oppression of liberalism. Okay. Those things are masked and covered up. All right. So once you have the kind of religion becoming private and the secular values ascending, they make it, folks who advocate that position make it seem as though liberalism and its values are incapable of abuse or oppression. But of course they are, because they are their own ideological religious commitment. But that whole conversation gets masked and covered up. That's a necessary kind of byproduct or consequence of this separation. 4, the category of religion itself becomes a means of distorting the nature of the church, and thus relegating questions about what is true or false, right or wrong, on any spiritual or philosophical level to a secondary, less important position, in contrast with the cost and benefits analysis that is used within government agencies and government institutions. And you can tell that this is leading, like he kind of mentions, into a kind of secular rationality that is literally incapable of seeing the world as participating in God's grace. Okay. And the church, to a large degree, has adopted this view, right? The idea here that the world does not participate in God's grace, that only happens within the church. So if you want to participate in God's grace, you have to do it within the church. Now, think here of other thinkers we've mentioned, the neo-orthodoxy movement, right, which we talked about with respect to Duns Scotus and his universality of being. John Milbank and Catherine Pickstock of the radical orthodoxy. The idea that, no, it's all God's, and anything that has being is, ontologically, is predicated in some way, shape, or form from God. That was the position of the church, and that was the position of Christian thinkers in one way or another, broadly speaking, until you see this secular rational shift. And that makes the church, according to Huebner, incapable of being what the church is supposed to be. Okay. Now, Huebner's going to claim that all the different Reformation movements he mentions kind of played into this unintended granting of autonomy to the state. And I'm not going to take up that proposition, but it's a proposition that I think is worthy of discussion and investigation. So, as he moves into talking about the different Reformation movements and their leaders, as he starts that section, he notes that ethics for this period centers on kind of the Reformation and reformers' disagreement with Rome. Okay. So essentially, what he's saying is you can't answer the ethical questions without answering first the bigger theological questions about whether salvation is about what we do for God or about what God does for us. Because here we're back to the cross, as mentioned earlier, right? How you answer the question of justification, which is, the salvation of God in Christ, how you answer that impacts um, extremely your view of what the church is supposed to look like and what members of that church are supposed to do in order to live the Christian life. And you don't have to look any further, obviously, than the difference between the Roman Catholics and the Lutherans and the Calvinists, and all three of them in the Anabaptists, for goodness sake. So now it is also worth mentioning here that Huebner does get, when we talk about Luther, he gets a few things wrong. Well, he gets several points wrong, actually. Number one, um, he makes it sound like Aristotle, or excuse me, like Luther just hated Aristotle straight out. And while he had obviously very little use for Aristotle in terms of coram Deo, or standing before God, it's interesting that he had nothing but good things to say about Aristotle when it came to coram mundo, us in the world, us before the world. So if you go to the Apology, Article 4 on justification, you'll hear Melanchthon saying things like, quote, no one speaks as clearly about active righteousness as does Aristotle. Okay, so yeah, he read one book by an author on Luther and Aquinas. Makes me wish I had my library here because I have it in my library at home. But he calls Luther's theology new, Luther's new theology. Of course, if you know anything about Luther, the reformers, the Lutheran reformers, went to great lengths to point out, decisively so, that their theology is everything but new. What was new were the introductions of gospel obscuring articles of faith and doctrine by the Roman Catholic Church, centered on justification. So not new. And he links Luther, I don't get this at all, to Max Weber, who was a sociologist at the turn of the 19th century and the 20th century. He links Luther to Max Weber's Protestant work ethic. And I just don't understand. This is just flat not accurate. For one, Weber's analysis really centers more on Calvinism than it does on Lutheranism. And there are several studies that have demonstrated that Weber's thesis is essentially wrong. So what they did is they basically examined whether or not, from the economic reality of people in Germany from the 12th century to the 19th century, to see whether or not Protestant doctrine and teaching in churches, impacted the people economically, in some sort of way. And the answer is no, it has not. He also ends the section by talking about Luther dividing the world into two morally independent realms. And that's just not accurate as well, because the two kingdoms, which he uses to set up that notion that Luther divides the world into two independent realms, right? The civil on the one hand and the church on the other. The two kingdoms is predicated on the seriousness of sin and how God has manifested chosen to manifest himself through the gospel of Jesus Christ. Excuse me. There can be no gospel where there is coercion in law. But he's taking that the distinction outside of the full reality of the scriptural narrative with respect to the seriousness of sin, right, and the role of grace in justification. When you understand that and see that that is the starting point, not just for Luther but for Paul and for Jesus, the idea that you would somehow mix these two is just incomprehensible, because that's essentially what you have whenever you introduce works, even on the slightest scale, right? You introduce a notion of coercion or reward, right? Not faith. I.e., if you do this, good things will happen. If you don't do this, then bad things will happen. And that is the role of the law, but the law's primary purpose is to show sin so that God can do his proper work through the gospel. So he moves on to Calvin after this. He's absolutely right. Sovereignty of God is absolutely central to Calvinism versus justification through faith, right, through Jesus Christ, which is the Lutheran kind of focus. Because it's the central focus of Scripture, therefore, the conversation of God with his people via law and gospel within Lutheranism, within Calvinism, that's replaced with kind of this monolithic approach that's unable to sustain a lot of the biblical tensions that we see within Lutheranism. For example, just one off the top of my head would be like Simul Justus et Peccator. He goes on to talk about the Anabaptists. And this is a good way of understanding the Anabaptists. All moral space for the Anabaptists, all political space, is for witnessing to the radical way Christians are called to live, right? So you don't baptize infants, because if you baptize infants, right, you're just kind of baptizing everyone, which is a kind of jump in logic, but that's what Huber says. If you baptize everyone, how do you know the difference between the true Christian and the false Christian? But of course, what happens when your theology and your theological program is foundationed on using outward works to distinguish true and false Christians? Well, what happens is you lose the gospel, and you end up with either despair on the one side or hypocrisy and pride on the other. And it's very interesting because the neo-Anabaptists, who are the post-Constantinian group of guys like Stanley Hauerwas out of Yale and John Yoder, people that this guy is sympathetic to. There's a theologian, a sociologist of religion out of Virginia named James Davis Hunter, wrote a book on how to change the world on culture, but he pegs the neo-Anabaptists correctly, because what he ends up calling them, neo-Anabaptists, they have a passive aggressive ecclesiology. Okay, what that means is that like nobody's getting it right or being a true Christian except them, which just highlights Huebner's point here, that your theological program is based on determining who's in and who's out. So you have to be in and everybody else is out, and kind of screwing it up. And he went through and documented Stanley Hauerwas and some of these other Anabaptist thinkers' rhetoric and how they engage in discourse, and they're ruthless, and they're just not kind. And there's a consistent enough pattern there where it's like, well, where's this coming from? Well, it's coming from the idea that you have to, use every space to be a outward manifestation of the fact that you're a true Christian, right? Because if you let up on that at all, well, then you're not being a true Christian. So there is this very intense law pressure on Anabaptists to live this particular life. And of course, if you know anything about the dynamics of law and gospel, you know that the gospel is going to get lost within there, because justification and the work of Jesus just isn't at the center.